evening such as we had spent hundreds of times before, pottering in the garden, with the gnats biting sultrily, and occasional oaths and the sound of breaking glass coming from the corner, where, instruction sheet in hand, Charles was putting up his own greenhouse. Solomon had had his bottom smacked for rolling in the peonies, Sheba for stalking Father Adam's bantams. Solomon had stunned a wasp and been prevented from eating it in a nick of time. Sheba, always out for effect, had stretched herself in a Diana-like attitude in a seed box on the garden wall, causing quite a sensation among passers-by, and an even greater one with Charles when he discovered she was lying on his lettuce plants. An ordinary, normal evening. Until the moment when I went to call them in for supper, and found, instead of the usual bedtime tableau of two little cats sitting sulkily on the wall, wondering whether we wanted them any more, only Solomon. Solomon happily boxing midges in the dusk. His only comment when we asked him where Sheba was an assurance that he didn't know, but if we were worried about it, he could easily eat her supper as well. We searched for her for 3 hours without success. Leisurely at first, expecting to see her small pale figure come tearing down the lane or out of the woods at any moment. Then, more concentratedly, with torches looking in outhouses and old barns, tracking and calling endlessly through the woods, while Solomon, locked in before he could decide to do a Stanley act and vanish as well, wailed reproachfully at us from the kitchen window. At 1 o'clock, we went to bed. Not to sleep, but to wait for daylight so that we could go on searching. It was one of the most miserable nights I've ever spent in my life. Not only on account of Sheba, who by this time I imagined a mangled little heap in some fox's den, on account of Charles, who lay there holding forth alternately on the fox which he was going to kill with his bare hands when he caught it, and a mysterious perambulator he now remembered being pushed up the hill at dusk. And the more he thought of it, the more certain he was. He kept telling me that Sheba had been in it, being kidnapped. On account also of the perishing gale which blew round the bed like Cape Horn, and was the result of having every door and window in the house wide open, so that we could hear if she called, and not least on account of Solomon, who at 2 o'clock started howling his head off in the spare room. Poor little chap, said Charles, when after a particularly piercing scream, we decided we'd better have him in with us before he woke the entire valley. He's missing her too, he said, as Solomon, with a reproachful sniffle, marched in and peered suspiciously under the bed. He wasn't, of course. All Solomon was worried about was whether we'd had Sheba in with us and not him. When he discovered she was nowhere to be seen, he snuggled happily down with his head on my shoulder, and within a few minutes was snoring like a pig. A little later, the snores gave way to the steady grinding of teeth, dreaming happily of being able to eat all Sheba's suppers in future as well as his own, and drowning, incidentally, any chance we had of hearing her footsteps if she did come back. Solomon slept. The cause of the trouble returned at 9 o'clock next morning. We had been out since daybreak, combing the woods again, calling her till we were hoarse, looking apprehensively in streams and cattle troughs in case, like a small blue Ophelia, she floated there among the duckweed. Father Adams had arrived, spade in hand, with the intention of digging out the fox's earth in the wood so we might know if that had been her end. Charles flatly refusing to believe we had lost her forever, and enlarging on his theory that, presumably bound and gagged since we'd heard no sound, she'd been carried off in the perambulator, was on the point of ringing Scotland Yard. Solomon, with his smuggest, "I'm here, aren't I?" not silly like Sheba expression, was sitting conspicuously on the cooker, determined not to miss anything. I, gazing dumbly at the kitchen table, was trying to realise that never again would I see her sitting there explaining earnestly just why she wanted more fish. Usually because Solomon had pinched hers while she wasn't looking, when there was a cracked soprano wail, and in she stalked. We never discovered where she'd been. From the mud on her paws and her worn-down claws, I personally believe she must have been accidentally locked in somebody's outhouse and spent the night trying to dig her way out. Sheba herself supported Charles. Kidnapped, she assured us, crossing her eyes and beaming enigmatically every time we looked at her. Locked in a cellar with iron bars and a great big man on guard. Got through a window and walked 10 miles home with the kidnappers hunting her every inch of the way. Make a good story for television, wouldn't it? She demanded, sauntering airily over to her plate to see what was for breakfast. Whereupon Solomon did what I felt very much like doing myself, knocked her down and bit her on the bottom. Chapter 3, The Reason Why. The immediate reasons for the things that happened to us were indeed obvious. You didn't need to look far for the reason why people thought we were nuts, for instance, when practically every day saw us marching through the village at least once carrying those wretched cats in public procession. Charles, pink with embarrassment, because the only way Sheba would be carried was flat on her back in his arms, gazing adoringly up into his face. I, with Solomon dangling goofily down my back like a sack of coals, while I held on to him by his back legs. Unless, of course, it was the fly season, when, though I still held him by his back legs, with his front ones, he would be flailing the air behind me like a demented windmill. Even people who knew us, who knew that we were only fetching them back from the Rectors or the Williamses or whoever it was that had rung up to complain about them this time, looked at us a bit oddly on such occasions. People who didn't know us usually thought we ought to be locked up. Father Adams, who owned a Siamese himself and knew what it was like through his, he said, though his, he said, was pretty good these days, except when our two devils led her into mischief, was quite indignant one night when somebody said as much in the Rose and Crown. Said he seen thee sliding out of the woods on thee backside with a dappy girt cap round thee neck, he informed me over the gate. His voice, as was usual when he was conducting a conversation at a distance of more than 3 feet, a full-blooded bellow that could be heard all over the village. Probably he had at that. The wood was on a steep slope, and once, having caught Solomon, the only way to get out of it without letting go of him was to sling him over my shoulder and slide down on my seat, with the result that, in a community where practically every female under 40 wore jeans, I could be identified a mile away by a large black mud patch on mine. What had annoyed Father Adams, however, was the stranger's inference that I was odd, coupled with the observation that he supposed most country people were a bit touched anyway. I told he roared, tipping the brim of his hat belligerently over his eyes, like the characters he had seen on telly when they, too, had put somebody properly in their place. I told he, not half I didn't, what I inquired wearily, for I knew Father Adams' home truths of old. Exactly had he told them. It was as I feared. Father Adams had first informed him that I weren't as daft as I looked, followed by the announcement that if he thought I were, he ought to have been here a few years back, when he had advised the startled stranger triumphantly he'd have seen I was going round with a squirrel on my head. I am digressing here, however. What I was really coming to was that Charles was right. There was a reason, a deep-seated fundamental reason way back behind all those immediate reasons why things happened to us. And I knew what it was. Sometimes, being only human, I was inclined to blame it solely onto Charles. The time the brakes froze on the car, one bitter night, miles from anywhere, for instance, and having left the tools at home for safety as usual, the only thing he could think to do was light a candle we happened to have in the car and lie hopefully underneath trying to thaw them out. That was bad enough. The wind kept blowing the candle out, and by about the 20th time, Sterling Moss had held it silently out from under the car for me to relight. I was so mad I could have jumped on it. What was really so dispiriting, however, was that when eventually a man did come along with a spanner and managed to free the brakes, no sooner had we coasted a few yards down the road to prove they were free, than Charles said we really must go back and thank him. Before I could stop him, he had put the brakes on again. And there we were, frozen rigid as before. At that stage, I leaned my head on the roof of the car and wept. If I'd listened to my grandmother, I howled, while the snow melted forlornly in my snow boots, and Charles, looking nervously over his shoulder, said, "Shh, not here." The man was listening. If I'd listened to my grandmother, I'd never have married him. It was quite untrue, of course. My grandmother thought Charles was wonderful. If she'd been there at that moment, she'd probably have been under the car herself, button boots and all, holding the candle with him. I remember the time before we were married when he called for me one night in the pouring rain with a hole in the roof of his sports car right over the passenger seat, and the hole itself stuffed with the Financial Times. There he was, dressed to kill, in +4s, diamond check golf stockings, and a white racing helmet. There he was, tightening the string that held the exhaust pipe on and adjusting the windscreen wiper. Only for effect, of course. It hadn't actually worked since Charles bought the car. The real operative system consisted of another piece of string tied to the wiper, with an end dangling in through each window. And as we went along, we pulled it alternately in a sort of rhythmic rowing motion. There he was, dangerous living, +4s and all personified. If my father could have seen either the car or Charles in that helmet, he would have had a fit. But father was engineering far away. Grandma was my legal guardian, and all Grandma did was gaze nostalgically at the golf stockings and say she wished she were 40 years younger. Halfway up the street, with the pair of us pulling away at the wiper strings like a couple of Cambridge strokes, the car backfired, and the Financial Times descended onto my lap, followed by a gallon or so of water which had collected on the sagging roof. Even then, Grandma was undismayed. As we walked back spasmodically to the front door, she came running out with an umbrella. That I didn't grab it and hit Charles on the helmet there and then, that I meekly put it up inside the car, stuck the top through the hole in the roof, and with the umbrella itself tilted smartly out of the port window. Otherwise, said Grandma, the rain would run down inside the car and Charles would get wet. Zoomed off up the road again, as if I always went about in cars with my umbrella up, that I said nothing at all about the fact that I was now soaked to the stomach because, as Charles kept reminding me, he'd promised to meet old Ian at 7:30 and we were already late. These things are of no importance at all, except as evidence that even in my salad days, I should have had my head red. What is important is that there, in a nutshell, is the basic reasons why things happen to us. On my left, Grandma, with whom I'd lived in a state of impending calamity since the day I was born. On my right, Charles, with whom I was to continue in that state from the day we were married. They had much in common, Grandma and Charles, including a passion for gadgets that were either impractical or, when handled by them, impossible. Gadgets that were impossible for them, of course, were not necessarily impossible for other people. Take Charles's electric drill, for instance. So simple that, to quote the advertisement, a child could use it. The first day he brought that home, he used the sanding attachment to polish an old copper kettle I'd just bought in a junk shop. Wild with enthusiasm, he not only sanded a hole clean through the kettle bottom, He also, as a result of doing the job in the bathroom, because he said that was the most convenient PowerPoint, turned the bath and lavatory seat emerald green in a shower of copper dust, which, I regret to say, became embedded, and we have an emerald-spotted lavatory seat to this day. When he used the paint mixing attachment, he not only mixed the paint, he went on so long that eventually the whole lot shot out in a sort of circular tidal wave, and Solomon, hanging hopefully around in case we were getting something to eat, became temporarily the only Seal Point Siamese in existence with bright blue ears. When he used the drill itself with no attachment whatever to drill a couple of holes to fix a switch for the hall lights, he managed that all right. The trouble was, he then went on to fix a switch that was, according to Father Adams, big enough for Battersea Power Station, with 2 little inch-long screws. The result was that within 2 days the switch came off in somebody's hand, and for the next 6 months, until Charles, who flatly refused to have a smaller switch, remembered to buy some longer screws, the switch, with a couple of whacking great cable wires attached, lay tastefully on the hall table, and anybody who wanted to go upstairs operated it from there. Aunt Ethel, grovelling one day for the switch which had fallen down behind the table, and coming up instead with a dead mouse, which had been filed there by Sheba, said she didn't know how I stood it. The answer was simple, of course. This was exactly how I had lived with Grandma, down to the gadgets which invariably went wrong, down to the paint. Grandma had once painted some chairs, putting the second coat on before the first was dry, and for weeks, when unwary visitors sat on them, there had been a gentle rending sound every time they got up, even down to the mice. Grandma once had a cat called MacDonald, who was bitten by a mouse. Believe it or not, she used to say she had seen that cat one day with a mouse which had its teeth firmly fixed in his chin, while MacDonald himself, one paw on the mouse's tail, his head strained upwards like a giraffe, and the poor old mouse, stretched like elastic in between, tried desperately to lever it off. As a result of that experience, MacDonald had developed a complex about mice. When he caught them, he no longer ate them, but laid them out in rows in conspicuous places and gloated over them. Visitors needed jolly strong stomachs to take tea in our house in those days, when, more often than not, there were 6 mice laid out on the rug before their very eyes, and a big black cat sitting proudly by the side of them like a pavement artist. But Grandma would never allow them to be taken away from him. It would hurt his subconscious, she said. It was his way of retrieving his pride after the mouse had bitten him. If people didn't like it, she said, when any of us remonstrated with her, they could do the other thing. We would soon have been left without any friends at all, if it hadn't so happened that Grandma also had 3 parrots, and that one day Paquita, the Senegal parrot, bit MacDonald on the paw when he was seeing how far he could reach into her cage. Paquita was always biting people. She was the most fiendish bird I've ever come across, and that, considering the number of parrots Grandma kept in her time, all of which bit at the slightest instigation, was saying something. She was small, with a green back, orange stomach, yellow legs, and a grey, snake-like head. She had pebble-grey eyes, which were also cold and snake-like, except when she got annoyed, when they turned bright yellow and went on and off like a Bilishire beacon. You could always tell when Paquita was going to attack by the flashing of her eyes. The trouble was, by that time, it was generally too late. Her usual time for attacking was when she was being fed, and, with Grandma's usual inconsistency, while her other parrots all had cages with seed tins that fitted from the outside, Paquita alone had a cage where they hooked onto the inside. She also, lucky little bird that she was, had a door which, instead of opening outwards, slid vertically up and down in grooves like a portcullis. Every member of the family, with the exception of Grandma, was trapped at some time or other by that blasted door coming down on their wrist while they were putting in the seed tin, whereupon Paquita, her eyes flashing on and off like neon signs, dived down and bit them solidly in the thumb. Grandma was as deaf to our complaints about Paquita as she was about McDonald's mice. If she bit us, she said, we must have offended her and it served us right. Paquita, she would observe with the air of finality which she always adopted to complaints about her pets, never bit her. The astonishing thing was that she was right. Grandma could do anything with birds, just as she could with animals. Immediately one of us was bitten, even while we were still hopping round, doubled up and sucking our thumbs in anguish. Off she would sweep in great concern to comfort Paquita. And there, a couple of seconds later, you would see that horrible bird lying on her back in the bottom of the cage, wings widespread, eyes closed in ecstasy, while Grandma tickled her on her stubby little stomach and said, what a wicked lot we were to torment her. What with McDonald's mice and Paquita biting life was pretty arduous for us just about then, and it seemed to everybody except Grandma, anyway, poetic justice, when in the end our two crosses cancelled themselves out. Paquita, as I've said, bit MacDonald one happy afternoon when he put his paw in her cage. And MacDonald, no doubt remembering what Grandma was always saying about his subconscious and the need for him to retrieve his pride, subtly plotted his revenge. The rest of the day he sat licking his paw and glowering darkly at her from under a chair. That night, while we were all in bed, he marched purposefully into the sitting room, knocked her cage off its table. The sliding door, which had been our own downfall so often in the past, slid smoothly up in its grooves for the last time. And that was the end of Paquita. When we came down next morning, we found the cage upset, birdseed all over the floor, and Paquita herself laid out regimentally on her back alongside the night's catch of mice. Grandma was inconsolable at her death, right up to the loss of the next of her parrots, which happened a long time afterwards and was another story altogether. She never stopped mourning Paquita and saying how she was the best, most faithful, most loving parrot she had ever had. As for MacDonald, sitting up there so proudly and waiting for her to congratulate him on his night's haul, he, bewilderment in every line of his fat black face at her sudden change of attitude, got the tanning of his life and never caught a mouse again. Any time after that, if he even thought of chasing a fly, he would hesitate, look at Grandma, lower his ears, and slink under the nearest chair. Humans, he said, gazing stonily at us out of his big yellow eyes while we stroked his ears and promised him a consolatory saucer of milk when she wasn't looking, were horrid. Chapter 4, Blondin. My grandmother was awfully pleased when Charles and I acquired a squirrel. It just showed how we liked animals, she said. I took after her, as she'd always said I would. Charles. She'd always liked Charles, and to think of his taking this dear little orphan of the woods, comforting it and bringing it up, it just showed how right she'd always been. Actually, Grandma, as usual, was as far from right as she possibly could be. We hadn't adopted Blondin willingly. We liked animals, yes, but squirrels, as in those carefree, far-off days, Siamese cats were hardly our cup of tea. All we had aspired to until then had been 3 blue Rex rabbits, with which Charles, fired by a book entitled How to Make Money in Your Spare Time, had once dreamed of founding a flourishing rabbit business. The idea was that he would sell the carcasses at tremendous profit to a shop, and as Charles was continually pointing out, they had magnificent pelts, could have a fur coat. What actually did happen was that 6 months later, by which time we had a grand total of 27 rabbits, and they were costing us a fortune in bran and potatoes, Charles announced that he couldn't kill them. They were his friends, he said, particularly the little one with the white foot. Had I noticed, he asked, how that one could actually climb the wire of the hutch door like a monkey when it was opened, and the knowing way it would sit up on the top tier and wait to have its ears scratched. As a matter of fact, I hadn't. I was too busy cooking buckets of bran mash and scouring the hedgerows for dandelions. One thing I did jolly well know, however, was that I wasn't going to be the one to kill them. Neither could we afford to go on keeping them in rapidly expanding multiples forever. The outcome of that affair was that Charles's friends eventually departed en masse one Saturday afternoon on a hand barrow, hutches and all. We had sold them alive to another breeder, a small boy, who informed us firmly that the bottom had fallen out of Rex rabbits, and that while 6 months earlier we had paid £7.10 for 3 of them, the best he could do for us now, for our total of 27, was 30 bob, including hutches, if he said with a meaning glance at Charles we wanted to sell them alive. Well, there we were. We didn't adopt Blondin willingly. Neither was he, the dear little orphan Grandma so imaginatively described. He was a silly clot who had fallen out of a 30-foot high dray one cold March afternoon. No doubt as a result of his own nosiness, and when we found him, he was lying at the foot of a towering pine tree, shivering, hungry, so young that his tail hadn't even feathered out yet, but was thin and stringy like a rat's, so tiny that he couldn't even crawl. Charles, having firmly refused to climb 30 feet to put him back in the dray, though many a time later he was to wish fervently that he had, the only thing we could do was to take him home with us and look after him until he could fend for himself. Contrary to my grandmother's picture of Charles comforting and nourishing him, I, incidentally, was the one who gave him a good going over with flea powder when we got there, and I was the one who kept getting up at hourly intervals throughout the night to feed him warm milk from an apostle spoon. I was also the one, when he woke next morning to the realisation that somebody was going to have to give him hourly feeds through the day as well, if he was to survive, was detailed to take him to the office with me. When I pointed out that Charles's office was more private than mine, and he could much more easily feed Blondin without attracting attention, he looked at me incredulously. Who, he demanded with horror, had ever heard of a man feeding a squirrel in an office? I could have asked who had ever heard of a woman feeding one there either, but it wouldn't have got me anywhere. When I trudged tiredly into my office at 9 that morning, Blondin was with me, wrapped in a blanket, in a shopping basket. And that's where I'm going to leave it.